Ahead of September 2024, we are prepared to take necessary measures, including significantly limiting visas, and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours per week. 80% of international students or more work more than 20 hours a week. We will extend the temporary policy that has allowed eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week through till April 30th of 2024. So starting on January 1st of next year in 2024, a single applicant will need to show that they have $20,635 in funds to support themselves in Canada. We're proud that Canada is a top destination for talented students from around the world. International students contribute to campus life and Canada's multicultural spirit in communities across the country and are drivers of innovation. When we welcome international students, we benefit from new ideas and ways of learning and researching coming into our post-secondary system predominantly. However, some of these students have experienced serious challenges navigating life in Canada. A few weeks ago, I announced initial reforms to the International Student Program, including the development of a new framework to recognize learning institutions that provide top quality services and support, including housing to international students. It would be a mistake to blame international students for the housing crisis, but it'd also be a mistake to invite them to come to Canada with no support, including how to put a roof over their heads. It's why we expect learning institutions to only accept a number of students that they're able to provide for, able to house, or assist in finding off-campus housing. In welcoming international students, we have a responsibility to make sure that students are supported when they come to our country. We also want to ensure that international students don't become victims of unscrupulous individuals who offer them inadequate living conditions, sometimes even at inflated prices. Ahead of September 2024, we are prepared to take necessary measures, including significantly limiting visas to ensure that designated learning institutions provide adequate and sufficient student supports as part of the academic experience. In order to achieve this result, it is imperative that we work together with provincial and territorial governments, learning institutions, and other education stakeholders so we can ensure international students are set up for success in Canada. Enough is enough. If provinces and territories cannot do this, we will do it for them, and they will not like the bluntness of the instruments that we use. Our aim is to strike the right balance between welcoming international students and making sure all they have and all they need to thrive. I will communicate more on this in due course, but for today, I'm here to announce a few more immediate measures. International students need to be prepared for life in Canada, and we have a responsibility to make certain that they are well supported when they come to Canada. So starting on January 1st of next year, in 2024, the financial requirement for study permits will be raised to reflect the current cost of living. And as such, a single applicant will need to show that they have $20,635 in funds to support themselves in Canada, moving up from $10,000, as I mentioned in French. Moving to a more accurate cost of living level that helps international students arrive with necessary resources to live and study in Canada. Future increases will be tied to the low income cutoff that Statistics Canada publishes every year, similar to other immigration programs. This cutoff conveys the income below which an individual may be in strained circumstances as they have to spend a greater than average proportion of their income on necessities. Recognizing that students already have to show that they can cover their tuition as well as other travel costs, or cost of living threshold is set at 75% of the low income cutoff rather than 100%, and puts us on par with our competitor countries. So next year we intend to implement targeted pilots that will test new ideas aimed at helping underrepresented cohorts of international students to pursue their studies in Canada. And we also plan to work with institutions, provinces, and territories to provide students with what they need to succeed. And I will have more to say on this a little earlier on in 2024. I'd also like to update you on 3 temporary policies affecting international students that were set to expire by the end of the year. The main purpose for an international student to be in Canada is to study. However, since most students are currently halfway through their school year and some are working full-time to meet their needs, we will extend the temporary policy that has allowed eligible international students to work more than 20 hours per week through till April 30th of 2024, the end of the academic year. We're currently examining options for this policy in the future, but we know that 40 hours a week is untenable if you're a student, and are looking to potentially expand off-campus work hours for international students up to 30 hours per week while class is in session. Our data shows us that 80% of international students or more work more than 20 hours a week. We first implemented distance learning measures in 2020 due to the travel restrictions during the pandemic, and reduced them in scope in September of 2022. But since the vast majority of international students are now actually studying in person in Canada, we're extending this measure only to those starting programs before September 1st of 2024. And finally, in response to the labour market disruptions over the pandemic, we introduced a temporary policy granting post-graduation work permit holders an additional 18-month open work permit if needed. Those with a post-graduate work permit expiring by the end of this year remain eligible to apply, and we won't be extending that policy after that. Protecting and supporting international students from becoming vulnerable, whether that's to bad actors or simply meeting their needs in Canada, is one of the main goals of our review of the International Student Program. These students contribute to boosting Canada's economy. Taking these additional steps today contributes to our long-term goal, which is to preserve the integrity of the International Student Program. It'll be key in all this to work with our provincial and territorial counterparts, which have an important share of the jurisdiction and responsibility in this, as well as other education and stakeholders, including the learning institutions themselves, so that we can ensure that international students really are set up for success in Canada. Thank you, and on that, I'm glad to take your questions.
Minister, you referred to the universities not liking the bluntness of some of the instruments that you might use. What did you mean by that, and what do you expect universities to do?
So, Rafi, I mentioned institutions themselves, and they have a very large portion of the responsibility in making sure that the student experience is properly reflected in the resources that they're given, whether it's providing housing, whether it's providing proper health supports and a proper academic experience. There is a responsibility on behalf of the provinces that designate the learning institutions in question to make sure that those are actually the institutions that are worthy of getting visas from the government of Canada. There are, in provinces, the diploma equivalent of puppy mills that are just churning out diplomas. And this is not a legitimate student experience. There is fraud and abuse, and it needs to end. When you take, for example, the province of Ontario, there have been Auditor General reports that have recommended some very important measures that have not been put into place, and that has contributed to the abuse. So the bluntness of the instruments that we have at the federal government level, in addition to the fraud task forces, is the strict removal of visas, which can have a number of effects and can have ripple effects, whether we designate a particular institution in particular or whether we simply take other measures to significantly reduce this. The federal government can't do it alone because our measures and the measures that we have, the policies that we have, can have ripple effects on the portrait of an international student experience could look like, and we could potentially miss the mark. Provinces have a number of tools at their disposal, namely the regulation of the designated learning institutions that in some cases just need to be shut down.
Have you taken a look at what impact that extension could have on permanent residents in Canada who are competing for those same jobs with the students?
You're talking about the work hours?
Yeah.
Well, look, there's labor shortages across the country. The measure that was put into place during COVID was one that was designated to make sure that those shortages were being addressed. It was popular. We had heard legitimately from students that a 20-hour work week is doable and is something that people could actually study at the same time and work 20 hours. Also, employers were looking for people that could potentially commit for over 20 hours and perhaps only work 20. So it was limiting the availability for students out there. It is costly to be a student in Canada. So having that flexibility and dealing with those two competing public policies, I think, was one of the challenges that we're still juggling with. We know that over 80% of international students are factually working over 20 hours, but 40 hours is just untenable. It is not credible that someone, except for rare occasions, could work a full work week and actually study at the same time. I know, having done it myself, and I know lots of people that have worked very hard, but those 40-hour works week drain you, and it is not reflective of a proper student experience. But there is flexibility, and we were looking at an hour category in and around 30 hours, but it hasn't been decided yet. So given the financial pressures that current students in Canada would be feeling had we taken a decision to roll it back to 20 hours, it didn't make sense and would probably perhaps put more strain on students that are currently struggling to make ends meet. I don't think students are taking jobs away from other people given the labor shortages that are happening in Canada. My focus primarily is to make sure that the public policy that we have in place is one that reflects the ability of the student to actually do what they're supposed to be doing, which is study, without bankrupting themselves. So there's a middle ground there that we need to look at. I'm going to look at more data with my team to make sure that something like 30 hours actually makes sense. But currently, with the data that we know, rolling it back to 20 hours would have been on the draconian end of the spectrum.
Mean that there'll be fewer international students coming in because you've raised the financial requirements for people to come to Canada? Do you have any models or numbers on that?
We're currently looking at that, Mackenzie. It is what it is. The reality is that we need an international student program that is robust. Clearly, we compete with other countries for some of the top talent, but clearly we have become a country that has been targeted for abuse and exploitations by some unsavory actors. For now, I'm not worried about the absolute number. What I'm worried about is the students. students and to make sure that they have the proper student experience and that they are indeed studying, and that the unscrupulous institutions that exist today that aren't actually learning institutions but are a conduit for money going to some people that want to profit off them, and potentially some backdoor entries to Canada, are effectively shut down.